Hello, everybody. I'm Nutatiello, and this is my first podcast. This podcast is going to be about self-sufficiency. It may seem like a gardening podcast at first, just because raising your own food is a large part of self-sufficiency. Today, I'd like to go over some very simplified basics of gardening. The first thing to consider when growing anything is your soil. Soil pH is a hot topic for many gardening books, but if you cannot access the tests to tell you what your pH is doing, then you need another option. The way I look at it is if your soil is too acidic, your plants will develop a yellowing on the foliage. If it is too alkaline, they will develop a dark green foliage with even reddish hues. Adding aged manure when you see yellow and wood ash when you see dark green or red should balance out your pH. Now the next thing to consider about your soil is its composition. Soil composition has three main parts: clay, silt, and sand. To find your soil's composition, put your soil into a jar of water and shake it up. Then set it down and let it rest for several hours, sometimes even a full day. It'll separate so that clay is on top, silt is in the middle, and sand is on the bottom. You want a ratio of 20% clay, 40% silt, and 40% sand for most plants. You can add whatever you're lacking. Next, you should consider what individual plants need. In general, you want to give the plants the nutrients to grow the parts you want to eat. For roots, add phosphorus. For fruits, add potassium. And for leaves, add nitrogen. There are exceptions, but this is the trend most plants follow. For phosphorus, add bone meals. For potassium, use wood ash, but mix it with compost if you don't want to change the soil pH. For nitrogen, use well-rotted manure. Once you have your soil balanced the way you like it, you need to keep it that way. If you have limited space, you may want to use the same garden space every year. For this to work, you should amend the soil every year with compost and use crop rotations so you deplete the soil less. For crop rotations, in general, you want to plant from fruit to root and root to leaf. The exception would be nitrogen-fixing plants such as legumes. You can insert nitrogen-fixing plants between root and leaf plantings. If you have plenty of space, you can rotate between 4 garden plots, allowing each to rest 3 years in turn. This will allow the microorganisms to repopulate the soil and make compost less necessary. This makes planting each garden less complicated since you can plant anywhere you like. After you get everything growing nicely in your garden, you need to guard against other creatures who will eat your food first. To keep large animals, such as a deer, away, you will need deer fencing, or daily sprinklings of human hair clippings, or a good dog. For smaller underground animals, you can put strong metal mesh beneath your garden, or get a dog. With above ground rodents, you can plant mint around your garden, get a dog or cat. Basically, a dog is a good idea. Then we come to bugs. Coffee grounds ward off slugs and add nitrogen to your soil. Marigolds planted around your garden will keep most bugs at bay. Soap water spray can kill almost anything else. Next, I'd like to talk about how to propagate your plants. One simple way to propagate plants is from cuttings. In order to propagate from cuttings, you need to follow a few basic rules. First, cut a decent amount of the plant. Don't just cut one leaf. Cut at least a portion with 2 inches of stem. Then you can stick it in water or into moist soil. To help the rooting process, you can dip a dampened end into cinnamon or honey, which are natural rooting agents. When you propagate from cuttings, your days till harvest will be shorter. You are also guaranteed to get the same exact plant that you took the cutting from. This can be important with plants such as apples, which do not grow true to seed. Speaking of seeds, I'd like to talk about seed saving next. Something you'll find with seed saving is that many plants can cross-pollinate. When this is the case, I suggest bagging flowers to prevent cross-pollination. I'll give you an example of how to bag flowers. In the squash, melon, and cucurbit families, you get seeds from the fruits, which come from female flowers. In order to find the female flowers, you look for a little swelling behind the flower. You bag those flowers by putting a little paper bag over them and taking a twist tie and lightly tightening it around the back of the flower. You don't have to bag all of the flowers, just a couple that you plan to save seeds from. When the flowers that aren't bagged are in full bloom, the flowers that are bagged should also be in full bloom. This is when you need to hand pollinate. To hand pollinate, you find the male flowers, or the flowers with no swelling behind them, and wiggle a paintbrush or a Q-tip inside of it. Then, unbag your flowers, wiggle that same paintbrush or Q-tip inside of it, then rebag your flowers. Once fruit starts to form, you can remove the bags, but make sure you mark the fruits that you plan to save seed from so that you don't mix them up with the ones that may be cross-pollinated. Now let's talk about a few other plant families. The carrot family produces umbels, or round clusters of flowers. When they start to flower, cover them with paper bags and tighten lightly with a twist tie. When the flowers are in full bloom, uncover them, bounce the umbels against each other, and recover them. When the flowers start to wither, you can remove the bags. There are a lot of things in the Brassica family. Brassica family tends to have numerous tiny flowers that are impossible to keep track of. Because of this, I suggest throwing fine mosquito netting over the plants and alternating the breed that doesn't have the net day by day. This way, insects will only pollinate one group of plants at a time. If you are growing indoors or have very few insects, you should hand pollinate the flowers by twirling a Q-tip or paintbrush over several flowers. Wash off the paintbrush or Q-tip or change Q-tips when you switch breeds. You also must bag corn if you have more than one breed or anyone within a mile is growing corn. Put paper bags over the tops of the unformed cobs and secure it with a rubber band. Then, when they are about 4 inches long, detassel the tops, or remove the tops, and beat the tops against the silks that are hanging off of the cobs and recover the cobs. This should cause a fully kerneled cob of corn, and it will also ensure that you are not having any crossbreeding with your neighbors. Next, you will find that peppers, tomatillos, and tomatoes all do better when their seeds are fermented. First, dig the seeds out of the fruit and leave whatever slime they have on them. Put the whole gooey mess of seeds into a cup of water. Cover it with a cloth or coffee filter. Let it sit out of the way for a couple of days until it smells slightly like vinegar or it has small bubbles. Throw out any floating seeds because they aren't viable. Keep the seeds that are at the bottom. Dump off the goo in the infertile seeds and let the good seeds dry out on a hard, flat surface. Next, let's talk about pruning. When pruning a tree or bush, most plants follow some basic rules. First, always make clean cuts with a sharp tool. This will help prevent rot. Also, cut at an angle so the water drains off the cut, otherwise it could promote mold. Generally, you want to cut above a new outward-facing bud so that the tree continues to grow in that direction. You should keep branches uncluttered, otherwise they can trap moisture and promote mold. To do this, you'll want to cut away anything that's facing inward and anything that's crossing. When they are crossing, pick something that's the best positioned or the oldest growth to leave. Now, some things need to be pruned in wildly different ways. For instance, raspberries have to be pruned twice a year. This is because only the newest growth will produce fruit next year. So you have to cut away all the old growth after it fruits once, and then you have to prune it again in the winter to thin out your new canes so that there's only about 6 canes per foot. This way they don't overcrowd each other and compete for root space. Next, I'd like to talk about aeroponics, hydroponics, and aquaponics. At this point in time, I'd like to remind you that I'm only giving the basics here. Entire books could be written on each of these subjects. I'm not trying to write a novel right now. I'm just trying to give you an idea of what you could do to try and do these things. In my opinion, aeroponics is the most complicated of these three. But, to put it simply, aeroponics makes use of high-pressure misting of the roots of plants. This requires specialized nozzles and pumps. The water, with minerals or plant food added to it, is misted over the plant's roots at intervals based on the types of plants. Personally, I don't think this type of system is good for self-sufficiency because of all of the specialized equipment necessary. What if you need to replace something? Relying on outside manufacturers is not extremely self-sufficient, in my opinion. Up next is hydroponics. Hydroponics is when you plant your plants in either a coarse substrate or directly over water. The water also has added nutrients for the plants. The water is pumped over the plant's substrate or transferred by hand and gravity fed. If the plants are directly in the water, then it must be moving at all times or changed regularly so that mold and algae doesn't form. In my opinion, this one is a bit more self-sufficient. Not only can you transfer the water by hand and let it gravity feed, but you could also use compost tea as your nutrients. Compost tea is when you take compost, put it into water, and let it sit out in the sun for several hours. Then you use it. You can paint your compost tea container black so that you can also use it in the winter. Last but not least, we have aquaponics. Aquaponics is when fish are added to provide nutrients for the plants. They can be kept in the containers with the plants and feed on the roots, or they can be kept separate and fed other things. The rest of the operation is very similar to hydroponics. With this system, you can still transfer water by hand and gravity feed. You'll just have to keep your fish in separate containers so that they don't run out of water. Keeping your fish in separate containers means that you have to feed them something other than the roots of your plants. For this to be self-sufficient, you can make your own fish food. To do this, you can feed them raw or cooked meat, as well as grains and algae that you can grow in your own tank just sitting in the sun. The last thing I'm going to touch on today is square foot gardening. A square foot garden is usually a raised bed dug extra deep into the ground. Usually there is about 12 inches from the top of the soil down to the depth it is dug to. This allows for a plant's roots to grow straight down, therefore allowing more plants per square foot, hence the name square foot gardening. I mention this because in later podcasts, when I'm going over plants, I will probably mention how many can grow in a square foot garden as compared to a normal garden. Well, that's all I have for today. I'll either be making a podcast every week or every other week. I haven't quite decided yet. Either way, I'll be starting my podcasts on planting guides next. Another note, if you guys want a free PDF of the book I've written, email me at nuttatielloguides@gmail.com. That's nuttatielloguides@gmail.com. Continuing our journey to self-sufficiency, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.